Welcome to another edition of Hello CISO, and today we're going to be talking about managed devices and networks for remote teams. Specifically, we're going to be talking about two separate things: endpoint security and team education. Let's dive into it. In our episode on Shadow IT, we talked about a similar challenge. So that is where individuals within the organisation fly out under the radar of corporate IT, and the IT organisation no longer has visibility into what they're doing. When we move from the office into a remote work environment, we face a similar challenge, a loss of control challenge. When everything is behind the corporate firewall, you have 100% visibility into what's going on. If a threat makes its way into the organisation, you have safeguards in place to identify and deal with the threat. This can only be accomplished with something close to 100% visibility into the network. Once you send people home and they start to work remotely, that visibility dramatically reduces. If you try to recreate that level of visibility into people's homes, you effectively end up snooping on their families. 100% visibility into the remote network in someone's house is just not an option. So just like with Shadow IT, we're moving from an all-encompassing brute force sort of approach to an approach that needs to be a lot smarter, a lot more intelligent. In most organisations, we're going to be talking about a combination of endpoint security and user education. Let's talk about the problems those approaches solve. There are far too many risks to cover here, but we can cover a lot of ground with just the two big ones: malware and weak or reused passwords. As IT leaders, we know that the vast majority of malware takes advantage of vulnerabilities which have already been patched. So a very simple starting point, a very fundamental starting point, is to begin by keeping software up to date. Then on to passwords. We know that 80% of data breaches can be attributed back to weak or reused passwords. Getting everyone using a password manager is absolutely fundamental to protecting against precisely this sort of attack. Together, these two threats comprise a large portion of our risk landscape. But those threats are mostly neutralized with password managers and prompt software updates. And now we get to our two proposed solutions. Both endpoint security software and employee education can improve the use of password managers and increase the adoption rates of software patches. But while these measures are no-brainers, there are important considerations involved. Let's dive into those now. Let's start with endpoint security software, the software that minimizes threats and reduces the chances of someone entering a password into a phishing site. It can nag a user to install software updates, require the use of and automatically install a particular piece of software, and often includes some level of threat detection. This is a sort of one-to-one replacement for the control we used to have over internal corporate networks. Each device attached to a network creates a path for new threats, so locking each device down is an obvious response. But you also need to be careful of that instinct, because you could end up creating a lot of headaches for yourself. For example, let's say that you require endpoint security on every device and the employee does do something a little shady. That could also create a problem for you later on should that device become the subject of an investigation. Then there's the fact that we are talking about devices in people's homes, and people do have families. If the organisation needs access to the contents of the device, how does it impact the other family members who might share it? How do you, as an IT manager, separate what you need to see from what you don't need to see? There may also be ethical considerations. If you're asking an employee for access to their device, can they opt out? And if they do, might there be repercussions that they have to deal with? One approach is just to simply ship employees a corporate device. They have a device which is only ever intended for office purposes. Now that's a great separation of work and personal life, but that does also start to get quite expensive. So as you can see, there are many things to consider when we start to talk about deploying endpoint security, and we've only just scratched the surface. In addition to software solutions, many companies will attempt to educate employees about the risks of working from home. But many organisations don't quite get this right, or they approach it in a very haphazard way. At first glance, education seems like a resource-friendly way of reducing risk, until you realise it's not quite as simple as just creating a PDF and emailing it out to everybody. Employee education isn't a one-time thing. It needs ongoing support, so for example, something like an FAQ page they can turn to in the future. Education also can't just be a one-off thing, or even an annual thing. I have many memories of the annual corporate IT security training. Everybody would do the training once per year. They would watch the video and they'd answer the questions, and then somehow magically everybody was trained. That information didn't tend to stick very well. Education needs to be a much more continuous process, and simply doing it once, or perhaps just once every year, really isn't sufficient on its own. And then employees will run into scenarios that just simply aren't covered in the employee education. They still need people to turn to. They need a supportive IT department. So you can see that education can get quite resource intensive. And the simple fact is, no matter how good your strategy and execution is, you're never going to get 100% compliance through training alone. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to managing devices and networks for people working from home. We've covered only 2 potential risks and 2 potential solutions, but you can already see how the old approaches to new problems just aren't going to cut it. When people work from home, there are simply too many risks to account for them all. And given how resource-intensive any one approach can be, your best approach is probably going to be to prioritise and focus on them one by one. Minimising these risks will involve more than just throwing technology at the problem. One of the mistakes organisations make is simply trying to do too much at once, overwhelming their people with a laundry list of requirements which can be counterproductive. Short, clear instructions tend to be followed better than long, convoluted ones. What all this means is that you really need to consider things from the people angle too. Now that might mean working with your communications department to craft messaging such that those around you within the organisation, the ones that you really need to follow this guidance, can actually understand and act on that messaging. This speaks to the evolving role of IT as a group. And we're asking leaders these days not just to understand the business goals, but to help empower the individuals within that organisation by communicating clearly to them about security. We're also asking IT leaders to be master strategizers, to understand the security threats and prioritise them, keeping in mind that we're not going to be able to defend against every single one of them. And that's good news for IT leadership. All companies are becoming IT companies. And it's going to take talented leadership to identify the risks and guide organisations in the directions they need to go. If you've enjoyed this video as part of the Hello CISO series, then please give it a like and subscribe to the 1Password YouTube channel for more videos like this.